Most people think love is supposed to be the soft place, the reward, the shelter from everything else the world throws at you. But if we're honest with ourselves, love is also where the deepest wounds are made. Not because it is weak, but because it is close, because it is where we lower our guard, because it is where we expect safety without having to ask for it. And when that safety doesn't come, when the voice that should reassure instead criticizes, when the presence that should comfort instead intimidates, the body doesn't shrug it off, it remembers, it absorbs, it reacts. We talk a lot in this country about stress, about long hours, about economic pressure, about politics and headlines, and the constant churn of bad news. But most people overlook this quiet truth that the stress doing the most damage often doesn't come from strangers or systems. It comes from the people we love or the people we are supposed to love. And that raises a question we rarely sit with long enough. What happens to a society when the place meant to restore us becomes the place that drains us? I've lived long enough to know that this isn't a news story. Every generation carries its own version of it. But in the early years of this century, something changed. Science began to catch up with experience. Researchers started to put words and numbers to what people, especially women, especially children, especially those with the least power, had been saying for a long time, that constant tension in a relationship doesn't just hurt your feelings, it rewires your nervous system, it keeps cortisol elevated, it keeps the heart racing, it keeps the body braced for impact, even when no blow ever lands. And the body, as it turns out, is not good at pretending. It does not understand sarcasm when pain is involved. It does not understand, I didn't mean it like that, when fear has already taken hold. It understands threat. It understands unpredictability. And when love becomes unpredictable, the body treats it like danger. We learn that people in chronically hostile or emotionally neglectful relationships don't just feel tired, they are tired. Their sleep is disrupted. Their immune systems falter. Their risk of depression, anxiety, heart disease quietly rises, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, day by day, year by year. A slow tax paid in headaches, in fatigue, in numbness, in the sense that joy feels farther away than it used to. And what struck me then and still strikes me now is how often we told people to endure it, to toughen up, to be loyal at all costs, as if endurance were the same thing as strength, as if staying silent were the same thing as being mature. We praised commitment without asking whether it was safe. We honored privacy without asking who it protected. This wasn't just cultural, it was political. We treated emotional harm as a private inconvenience instead of a public health issue. We built systems that responded quickly to broken bones, but slowly, if at all, to broken trust. And when people finally spoke up, we often asked the wrong questions. Why didn't you leave sooner? Why did you choose them? Why couldn't you just make it work? But science gave us a different lens. It showed us that supportive, respectful relationships do something extraordinary. They calm the nervous system. They lower blood pressure. They soften stress responses. They give people the resilience to face the rest of their lives with steadier hands. In other words, connection isn't just emotional, it's biological. Love, when it is healthy, is medicine. That realization forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. If unhealthy relationships make people sick, then ignoring them isn't neutral. It's a choice with consequences that ripple outward from families to workplaces to entire communities. Because a person who is emotionally worn down at home carries that weight everywhere else, into classrooms, into offices, into civic life. I've seen this up close. Long before the White House, When I was organizing in Chicago, I met people who were fighting on every front. They were fighting landlords, fighting layoffs, fighting schools that had given up on their kids. But often, the hardest battles were the ones nobody saw. The relationship that made them doubt their worth. The household where tension never fully lifted. The quiet sense that rest was never allowed. And you could see it in their posture, in their energy, in how hard it was for them to imagine a different future. Not because they lacked courage, but because courage gets harder when your body is always on edge, when you are always waiting for the next criticism, the next withdrawal, the next explosion. Later in the Oval Office, I learned something similar at a different scale. When people feel unsafe emotionally or otherwise, they don't engage, they retreat, they harden, they simplify the world into enemies and allies. And that's not just true in politics, it's true in marriages, in families, in workplaces. Fear narrows us, safety expands us. Michelle used to remind me of this, sometimes with more patience than I deserved. That being right wasn't the same thing as being kind. That power, if it wasn't checked by empathy, could do real damage. And she was right. Leadership, whether in a country or a relationship, is not measured by how loudly you speak, but by how safe people feel telling you the truth. We don't talk enough about repair, about what happens after harm, because love isn't the absence of conflict, it's what happens next. It's whether accountability follows injury, whether listening follows defensiveness, whether change follows apology. And this is where the story gets harder, but also more hopeful. Because people do change. I've seen it. Couples who learn to argue without contempt, parents who stop repeating the wounds they inherited, workplaces that replace fear with respect, communities that decide suffering doesn't have to be normal. And when that happens, stress hormones fall, bodies relax, people breathe differently. That's not soft science, that's lived reality. And it raises one more question we don't ask nearly enough. If healthier love makes healthier people, and healthier people make stronger communities, what does that say about the kind of society we are choosing to build? There's a tendency, especially in a country that prides itself on self-reliance, to treat emotional strain as a personal failing rather than a shared responsibility. We tell people to manage their stress, to practice resilience, to meditate their way through pain, while leaving untouched the conditions that are producing that pain in the first place. And nowhere is that contradiction more evident than in our most intimate relationships, because love doesn't exist in a vacuum. It lives inside economic pressure, inside cultural expectations, inside histories of inequality and silence. When a couple is worried about rent, about healthcare, about whether a single mistake could unravel their future, stress seeps into conversations that were once gentle, words sharpen, patience thins. And suddenly, what looks like a personal failure is also a structural one. I think about the families I met during the recession that followed 2008. Folks who had done everything right, worked hard, played by the rules, yet found themselves underwater. The strain wasn't just financial, it was emotional. Men who had been taught that their worth was tied to providing suddenly felt ashamed. Women who were carrying both emotional labor and economic fear felt unseen. And children, always perceptive, absorbed it all without language. What science later confirmed was already visible then. Chronic stress doesn't just make people irritable. It changes how they interpret the world. It narrows empathy. It shortens tempers. It makes conflict feel existential. And when that stress is coming from the person you share a bed with, the person you built a life around, it cuts deeper than any headline ever could. This is where the moral dimension enters the picture, because societies make choices about what they value. We decide what we fund, what we normalize, what we talk about out loud. For too long, we treated counseling as a luxury, emotional literacy as optional, and domestic conflict as something best handled behind closed doors. And then we acted surprised when the consequences showed up in emergency rooms, in classrooms, in prisons. Leadership, I learned, is about setting a tone long before you pass a law. It's about naming what matters. When leaders speak honestly about mental health, about trauma, about emotional safety, it gives people permission to do the same. It tells a man that seeking help is not weakness. It tells a woman that fear is not the price of commitment. It tells a child that love does not have to hurt to be real. I remember moments in the White House when policy discussions would drift toward numbers and projections, and I'd try sometimes unsuccessfully to bring it back to people. To remind folks that behind every statistic was a kitchen table conversation, a late night argument, a silence that lasted too long. Because policies that ignore emotional reality don't just fail morally, they fail practically. You can't expect civic engagement from people who are emotionally exhausted. You can't ask for trust from those who have learned that vulnerability is punished. Democracy depends on a basic sense of safety, the belief that you can speak, disagree, and still belong. And that lesson is first taught at home. There's an old myth that strength means enduring anything, that love is proven by how much pain you can tolerate. But real strength, I've come to believe, looks different. It looks like setting boundaries. It looks like accountability. It looks like walking away from what is breaking you, even when staying would be easier in the short term. And that kind of courage rarely gets applause. I've met people who left relationships that were slowly destroying them. They didn't do it dramatically, they did it quietly, with fear, with uncertainty, sometimes with very little support. And what struck me was not their anger, but their relief, the way their shoulders dropped months later, the way their voices steadied, the way their laughter returned, tentative at first, then fuller. Their bodies knew before their minds could articulate it. Safety had been restored. Of course, not every story ends in separation. Many end in repair, in hard conversations that last longer than anyone wants, in therapy sessions where defenses crack and listening begins, in apologies that are followed crucially by changed behavior. And those stories matter too. They remind us that growth is possible, that love can mature rather than harden. But none of this happens in isolation. It requires access, it requires time, it requires a culture that values emotional health as much as physical health. When we invest in trauma-informed care, when we support families instead of shaming them, when we teach children the language of feelings and boundaries, we are not coddling society, we are strengthening it. Because a person who feels emotionally safe is more likely to participate, more likely to volunteer, more likely to vote, more likely to imagine a future that includes other people. And a nation made up of those people is sturdier than one held together by fear or denial. I've always believed that hope is not blind optimism. It's work. It's the daily choice to confront reality without surrendering to it. And nowhere is that work more intimate than in how we love, how we argue, how we repair, how we decide what we will no longer accept. So let me ask you, have you ever noticed how your body responds in the presence of certain people? Have you felt your chest tighten, your breath shorten, your thoughts race? Or have you felt the opposite, a sense of ease, of being seen, of not having to perform? What might those sensations be trying to teach you? When I was organizing in Chicago, long before anyone thought to put a microphone in front of me, I learned something that never left me. People rarely came into our meetings talking about policy. They came in talking about exhaustion, about arguments that never resolved, about feeling unseen by the very people who were supposed to know them best. The fight for better schools or safer streets often began with a quieter fight to feel respected at home, to feel steady enough to show up for others. And what struck me then, as it does now, is how quickly emotional strain turns into moral judgment. We look at a couple that's constantly at odds and call them dysfunctional without asking what pressures they're under. We look at a parent who's withdrawn and call them disengaged without asking how long they've been carrying fear alone. We label people broken when often they're just overwhelmed. The science helps us name what's happening, but it doesn't absolve us from responsibility. Elevated stress hormones, dysregulated nervous systems, inflammation that lingers long after the argument ends. These are not abstractions. They show up as headaches that won't quit, as patience that runs out too soon, as a constant readiness for conflict that makes rest feel unfamiliar. And when that becomes normal, we begin to mistake survival for living. There's a particular danger in that normalization, because once harm becomes familiar, it becomes invisible. We start to confuse intensity with intimacy, control with care, endurance with loyalty. And we pass those confusions down not through lectures, but through example. Children learn what love looks like by watching how adults argue, how they reconcile, how they fail, and whether they repair. They carry those lessons into classrooms, into friendships, into workplaces, and eventually into the voting booth. That's how the private becomes political without anyone intending it. A society that does not model emotional repair will struggle with civic repair. A culture that rewards dominance over understanding will find compromise suspicious. And a democracy that treats cruelty as entertainment should not be surprised when trust erodes. I saw versions of this dynamic even in the Oval Office. You'd have rooms full of accomplished people, armed with data and degrees, yet unable to hear one another because defensiveness had taken hold. The work stalled not because solutions were impossible, but because emotions were unmanaged. It was a reminder that power does not exempt us from human wiring. If anything, it amplifies it. That's why humility matters in love, in leadership, in democracy. The willingness to say, I was wrong. The discipline to listen without preparing your rebuttal. The courage to pause instead of escalating. These are not soft skills. They are stabilizing forces, and they require practice. We often ask why people stay in relationships that harm them. It's an easy question to ask from a distance. Harder when you consider the realities: financial dependence, cultural expectations, fear of loneliness, hope that things will return to how they once were. Love has a long memory. It remembers the good days vividly, and sometimes that memory keeps people anchored to pain. That's why support matters. Real support, not platitudes, not judgment, but tangible resources. Safe housing, affordable counseling, legal protection. Communities that say, we believe you and mean it. Because telling someone to leave without giving them a place to land is not courage, it's abdication. At the same time, we have to be honest about another truth. Not every wound is inflicted by malice. Some are inflicted by ignorance, by unhealed trauma, by patterns learned early and never questioned. That doesn't excuse harm, but it does complicate the path forward. Repair, when it's possible, demands accountability without humiliation. It demands boundaries without contempt. And it demands patience, something our current culture does not reward. Social media, for all its promise, has a way of flattening these complexities. It turns relationships into performances, conflict into content, comparison into a constant hum of inadequacy. You can be sitting next to your partner, scrolling through images of other people's curated happiness, and feel utterly alone. That kind of loneliness doesn't announce itself loudly, it settles in quietly. And over time, it convinces people that something is wrong with them rather than with the myths they've been sold. So we have a choice. We can keep pretending that emotional health is a private matter, best left unexamined, or we can recognize it as part of the infrastructure of a healthy society. Just as roads and bridges allow us to move physically, emotional safety allows us to move together, to disagree without destroying, to compete without dehumanizing, to love without fear. If any of this resonates with you, if you felt the weight of relational stress in your own life, I want you to pause for a moment. Ask yourself where your body feels most at ease. Ask yourself which relationships leave you more grounded, not more guarded. And ask yourself what repair might look like, whether that means a hard conversation, professional help, or a brave departure. These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones, and they're worth sitting with. If this reflection has stirred something in you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments, what you've learned about love, stress, and safety along the way. Subscribe if you want to keep having these quieter, deeper conversations, not for noise, but for understanding. If we're honest with ourselves, the hardest part of talking about love and emotional health is not the science, it's the mirror. Because once we accept that relationships shape our bodies, our moods, our futures, then we have to ask what we're contributing to the lives of the people closest to us. And that's a quieter reckoning than most of us are comfortable with. I've had moments in my own life where I realized that good intentions were not enough, that being busy was not the same as being present. That providing did not automatically translate into protecting someone's emotional safety. Those realizations didn't arrive with drama. They arrived late at night, after the house had gone quiet, when the weight of responsibility finally had room to speak. You learn over time that love is not proven by how strongly you feel in the easy moments. It's revealed by how you behave when you're tired, stressed, afraid, or disappointed. That's when habits surface. That's when old scripts take over. And unless those scripts are examined, they repeat themselves sometimes across generations. I've met people who could trace their anxiety back not to a single traumatic event, but to years of walking on eggshells, to never knowing which version of someone they'd come home to learning unconsciously that love meant vigilance. Their bodies learned that lesson too. Heart rates elevated, muscles tense, sleep light and restless. The body, doing what it was designed to do, stayed ready for danger even when the danger was emotional. What's sobering is how easily this kind of strain gets minimized. That's just marriage. That's just how he is. That's just stress. But stress, when it has no release, becomes a form of captivity. And captivity, whether physical or emotional, shrinks the imagination. People stop dreaming, they stop planning, they stop believing that something better is possible. That's not just a personal loss, that's a civic one. A society depends on citizens who can imagine a future different from the present, who can trust enough to cooperate, who can tolerate disagreement without feeling threatened. When people are emotionally depleted at home, they have less capacity to engage with the world beyond it. This is where leadership, real leadership, comes into focus. Not the kind that dominates headlines, but the kind that shapes conditions. Leadership that recognizes emotional health as foundational, that understands funding counseling services is not charity, that protecting survivors is not interference, that teaching emotional literacy is not indulgence. It's prevention. It's foresight. We often talk about resilience as toughness, but the kind of resilience that sustains societies is built on repair, the ability to name harm, the willingness to change behavior, the courage to apologize without qualifying it. Those skills are learned first in intimate spaces, and when they're absent there, they're scarce everywhere else. There's a myth that talking about feelings weakens us. In truth, unspoken pain does far more damage. It leaks out sideways through anger, withdrawal, cynicism, control. It finds expression whether we give it language or not. The question is whether it does so destructively or constructively. I've watched people transform when they realize that love does not require self erasure, that boundaries are not betrayals, that leaving what harms you can be an act of profound self respect, not failure. I've also seen relationships heal when both people were willing to confront patterns honestly, with help, without defensiveness. Not every story ends the same way, but every healthy outcome begins with truth. There's something deeply human about wanting to be chosen, to be valued, to feel secure. That desire doesn't disappear with age, status, or accomplishment. It follows us into boardrooms and bedrooms alike. And when it's chronically unmet, the cost is real to our health, to our patience, to our sense of self. So, when we talk about love in this era, this noisy, accelerated, digitally saturated era, we have to slow the conversation down. We have to move it away from performance and toward practice, away from fantasy and toward accountability. Love is not proven by grand gestures alone, but by consistency, by emotional safety, by repair after rupture. If you're listening to this and thinking about your own relationships, romantic, familial, professional, I want you to notice not just how they make you feel in the moment, but how they leave you afterward. More settled or more on edge, more yourself or less. That awareness is not selfish, it's information. And if you're someone who recognizes yourself on the other side of this equation, if you see ways you've contributed to stress rather than calm, then reflection is not condemnation, it's an invitation. Change doesn't begin with shame, it begins with honesty and support.